All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. And as most of you know, we've talked about Ukraine quite a bit over the past 3 years on the podcast, but things are starting to heat up, so to speak, right now on talks to try to end the war. And so, due to that, we have brought on Michael Kimmage today to talk to us about Ukraine and where things stand right now. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So, to start things off, just to kind of get a sense of where we are on the battlefield at this moment, because I know, there's been back and forth, stalemate, very incremental, small movement over the course of the years since the initial first year. But where are we right now as far as who holds what and maybe who has the leverage at the moment?
Right. Well, there have been times in the war when things have been very clear. The first few weeks, the nature of the Russian invasion, and then Ukraine's big gains in the fall of 2022. It feels to me at the moment like quite a lot is in the eye of the beholder. And that's part of the reason why the negotiations over ending the war are as complicated and at times as confusing as they are. So you can tell two separate stories, and they're both true. And one is that Russia has the momentum, is making incremental gains along the line of contact, especially in, Donbass, the sort of eastern part of Ukraine. And, of course, Russia still holds Crimea
Mhm.
and substantial parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia regions, oblasts in the south of Ukraine, and has a bit of a military presence along the border elsewhere. And that is, of course, giving Russia the optics of momentum because there is a reality behind it. And Ukraine is to a degree on its back foot. But in the eye of the beholder, you can tell a very different story as well, which is that Ukraine remains in possession of about 80% of its territory. Russia has not taken a major Ukrainian city since destroying and then taking Mariupol at the beginning of the war. And Russia has expended unbelievable amounts of manpower on taking the city of Pokrovsk, which they've sort of three quarters done as we speak this week. And that really doesn't look like victory. So there's a lot that is at stake in the telling of the tale, and the telling of the tale is not easy.
Yeah, for sure. And I like your explanation of it's all in the eye of the beholder because both sides have things they can point to demonstrating momentum and wins, and both sides have things that have gone not quite as well over the course of the last 3 years. And just for listeners' sake as well, I'd like to point out that we are recording this on the morning of December 2nd here in Washington, D.C. So that will obviously come into play since Witkoff is supposedly meeting with Putin today in Russia. But we'll get to that in a minute. Another key aspect of the war has been, you mentioned manpower on the Soviet side, or Freudian slip. You mentioned manpower on the Russian side. Um, but there's also been, obviously, over the course of this war, the major factor of Western aid to Ukraine. And the Trump administration, the second time around, came in, talking about ending that cooperation, ending that aid to Ukraine, with the need of the Europeans to step up and provide more aid. Um, you know, 11 months into the Trump administration, where are we on the aid front? Has that come to fruition where the United States has stopped a large part of its aid, or has it not? Have the Europeans stepped up? What do you see as the potential for continued aid? Because I know that plays such a major role in what Ukraine can and can't do.
So there are a couple of separate threads to tease out here. So the Trump administration has scaled back almost all financial assistance and the direct provision of military aid, but the U.S. is selling weaponry to Europeans and to Ukrainians that's being used on the front. So it's not as if the U.S. has completely halted, but it's changed the nature of its support. Where there is continuity is that the U.S. provides intelligence and targeting to Ukraine, and that's a very consequential aspect of the war effort, and that has not changed apart from a few days in the spring of 2025. That has not changed in the transition from the Biden to the Trump administration. So the U.S. is still there. That's really the fundamental diplomatic leverage that the U.S. has, that
Mm-hmm.
targeting and intelligence, but its presence is smaller. Um, Ukraine itself has made big strides in defense industrial production. That was the story of the first half of 2025, where Ukraine had a noticeable advantage on the battlefield because of its drone production and innovation, and the Russians have sort of caught up in the last couple of months and maybe now are a few inches ahead of the Ukrainians in terms of drone warfare. But Ukraine is not standing still. It is making strides and innovating. And Europe has committed itself, especially Germany, to very, very high levels of defense spending. But where it seems to me that Europe is lagging is on the more practical side of things. And there too, it's, to me, a shocking circumstance of the war that Russia for the last couple of months has been outproducing Ukraine with drones. When you put the European element in, to me, that's a shocking statistic because Russia's economy is 1/10 the size of Europe's economy. Obviously, Europe is not directly in the war, but still, there's a way in which either Europe is not producing the right things, or is going too slow, or is getting tangled up in red tape. But that doesn't have to be the case in 2026 and for the foreseeable future. But we have these multiple developments: Ukraine advancing, Russia advancing too. Europe, getting its act together, but slowly, and the U.S. gradually withdrawing its presence.
So let's take a step back for a second. So you and I are both historians, so we love bringing history into this, but it's not very hard to do, right? Because there's so much history around this issue, and also justifications through the use of history. So talk to us a little bit about how each side views this history between the two countries and has used it, especially on the Russian side.
Sure. Putin is an amateur historian. It's sort of our collective misfortune that that's the case.
Yeah.
Most of us believe that the more history is studied, the better. Maybe not in his case, or certainly not in his case. He's drawn from Russian history, what you could describe as an imperial synthesis from the Soviet period and the Imperial Russian period, which suggests to Putin, in ways that he's very happy to broadcast, that Russia has no borders, that the West is some fundamental existential threat to Russia just for being what it is, and that therefore Russia has an obligation to erect around itself a series of buffer zones. And in the case of Ukraine and also Belarus, there's a kind of cultural religious argument that Putin also makes about the medieval configuration of this territory, what Russia is as a result of that, and what Russia is entitled to as a result of that history. So it's not to be compared with the way history was used by the National Socialists, although they too were, captivated by history. I think it's a different narrative and deserves to be studied in its own terms. But it really is a motivating force for Putin. So if we jump forward just briefly to a point about negotiation, you're not just negotiating against Putin's basic territorial concerns, whatever they may be in Ukraine, you're negotiating against his historical sensibility. And
Right.
that's something that I hope the U.S. team is as aware of as it needs to be. On the Ukrainian side, there's a lot to say about history. It doesn't, it's a little bit harder to tie up in a neat bundle on the Ukrainian side. There's sort of different strands that you can see at work. On the one hand, you have a notion of Ukrainian pluralism that's taken from history, that Ukraine is a place where there's a lot of horizontal organization, civil society, and that has mattered a lot to the war effort and is a part of the story. And then there's also the question of Ukrainian nationhood, which is not a simple question. Ukraine has not really had a nation in political terms in modern history, briefly in 1918, and then of course after 1991. But that's one of the things that the war is creating in the way that wars do. And you can kind of go back to the title of a book by a Ukrainian politician in the 1990s, Ukraine is not Russia. And that's not always been the case. And there's lots of complexities on that point. But the war is driving that reality home and, sort of substantiating it for the future, as far as I can tell. It's separating Ukraine and Russia into two distinct entities and nation states.
So let's move a little bit more into current politics. And I think we have to talk about what's going on in Ukraine right now on the political front, because that is going to be a factor in negotiations that are ongoing right now. And, you've worked on Ukraine at the State Department. You've written a recent book on Ukraine. And this anti-corruption fight in Ukraine has been an ongoing story since it gained independence after the fall of communism and the fall of the Soviet Union. But that hasn't gone away, and Ukraine is in the midst of a major corruption scandal. So, can you talk a little bit about the role of corruption in Ukraine
Sure.
and just the broader former Soviet state in general? and what's going on right now and why that's so important to negotiations before we get into discussing the negotiations themselves.
I think two basic points to be made here, and one is not a Ukrainian point; it's a point about war. And I can think of few examples historically where wars make countries less corrupt. Wars concentrate executive power. There's lots of spending that goes on in wartime. Press freedom usually diminishes in all countries during wartime, and we've seen all of that in Ukraine. It's very, very unfortunate, but to me, not a huge surprise that at a time of political duress and also great spending and maybe not all that much oversight of executive power, that you have people who are in effect stealing, and
Mm-hmm.
very, very unfortunate, but not I think shocking. This does get superimposed onto the second point that one could make, and it's again not an exclusively Ukrainian point; it's a post-Soviet point, which is that all the post-Soviet governments struggled with separation of powers, and especially with the separation of judiciary from the executive. And Ukraine has just never been effective in making that separation. You have the Maidan in 2014, which is an
Mm-hmm.
anti-corruption revolution, among other things, and a very sincere one. And still, Petro Poroshenko, the not particularly corrupt president who emerges in 2014, he's not really able to make that separation between executive and judicial power. And Zelensky is also an anti-corruption president. He rises to power on the basis of a television program that's all about corruption and sort of purifying Ukrainian politics. And I take him at his word. I think he's sincere about that, but he hasn't also been able to make that separation. So wartime has intensified something that's there in the body politic in Ukraine and has been back in Soviet times and in post-Soviet times. And it's just really, really hard to make those reforms in general, but unbelievably hard to make them during a war.
Yeah, for sure. And I've read things recently that have been making the analysis that the negotiations at this point in time, with the fact that Ukraine is going through this major corruption scandal, and his top aide just resigned over the weekend, is going to put them on their back foot going into these negotiations and give the U.S. some leverage on that. Do you agree with that? Do you think this scandal hurts them that badly?
I'm not sure. When you compare and contrast two different things, is Ukraine so fragmented and fractured that it's going to sort of back down and give up on core principles? You know, if that's the open question, if they go down that road, it starts to look like surrender in the war, where the stakes are incredibly high
Mhm.
for Ukraine. And here you do have to measure, different realities against one another. That the realities of life under Russian occupation, we have lots of evidence about this, are about forced Russification, living under authoritarian conditions, filtration camps, abduction of children, etc. So that's very, very hard for any Ukrainian who's not living under occupation to sign on to. And so that makes me believe that, the corruption scandal will be endured, not that the figures will be admired for all of this, but that it will be
Right.
endured, and it will, sort of pass on to another stage. So I don't think it transforms into real leverage unless the U.S. is able to come up with such a attractive diplomatic package that Ukraine is, willing to sign on to it. But that's another conversation
Yeah.
and another set of parameters.
So moving more into the negotiations, and before we get into the current discussions that have been ongoing for a couple of weeks now, um, paint us a picture of what the demands or wants for each side up until 2 weeks ago were.
So we have to operate through a real fog in trying to understand Russian demands and even Russian motivations in this war. I'm sometimes frustrated by how glibly people say Putin wants this, Putin wants that.
Mhm.
He's willing to compromise, he's not willing to compromise. The basic reality is that we don't know, and we don't really know what he's driving for. Um, I, like many of my colleagues in Washington, the think tanks, and elsewhere, do not see evidence that Putin is moderating his position. So my baseline assumption is that Russia wants what it seemed to want on February 24th, 2022, which is basic control of the country, probably possession of several of its major cities, cities that it doesn't currently possess, Odessa, Kiev, etc., and the chance really to chart Ukraine's geopolitical future. So that's my baseline assumption. I
Mhm.
don't fault the Trump team for exploring that and seeing if that's true, or if there's some compromise that's maybe possible with Russia that doesn't seem visible on the surface, but that's where I would begin. I think on the Ukrainian side, it's a lot less difficult to explain. I don't think that Ukraine is unwilling at this point to trade territory for, you know, future possibilities, but those future possibilities have to be non-interference on the Russian side, which
Mhm.
is extremely difficult to guarantee. And the other future possibility has to be real integration into Europe, which is happening on the political and legal level. And I think EU membership is conceivable for Ukraine, but it's still very sticky on the security side. And that's not Ukraine's fault. That's the fault of partners of Ukraine that can't make up their mind about how important this war is or how much they want to be committed to Ukraine. So Ukraine knows what it wants. It's just not able to get there at the moment. Russia probably knows what it wants too. It's not able to get there at the moment too, and it's not a stalemate. It's just a war that looks like it's going to go on for a lot longer than a year or two at the moment.
Yeah, so that kind of little bit of a spoiler alert on how you think these current negotiations are going to turn out. But so walk us through, how you viewed the current talks. We're kind of hadn't had much going on over the past few months from a U.S. perspective on really trying to push some sort of deal after the initial Trump meeting with Putin in Alaska. Um, but things have picked up over the course of the past few weeks with this plan that came out. Seemed to be very Russia friendly to start. Then they have discussions with the Europeans and the Ukrainians. It seems to have gone back more towards the Ukrainian side, or at least towards the middle. And then Witkoff and Kushner are obviously meeting with Putin today. So what have you been hearing, or what do you think has been going on with this, and what's getting the American team to sort of rewrite these points before they go to Putin again, and just kind of how do you see this going on?
So I'll offer two words of praise for the Trump administration to begin with, and then conclude with some rather critical thoughts about how they're approaching this situation. I think that the Trump administration has a core insight into the war, which is correct, that neither side is going to win, and neither side is going to win entirely in its terms. What we were talking about
Mhm.
before is relevant. I don't think Ukraine is going to get all of the guarantees it wants, and Russia is certainly not going to get all of the territory that it wants. And so, if neither side is going to win, you know, in a way, the mood is let's wrap it up and get to the end phase as quickly as possible. And there's something, I think fundamentally reasonable about that. Secondly, unlike many European countries, I think the Trump administration is willing to do it messy in Ukraine. They're willing to talk to Russia. They're willing to concede a few points to Russia. They're willing to compromise on a few issues, and that's I think fundamentally correct. If you are going to get to an end phase with this, it's not going to be clean. It is going to be messy, and I sort of admire how comfortable the Trump team is with that, and would recommend that Europeans think about messy diplomacy because it's probably the most suitable to the situation. Doesn't cheer me to say that, but it's
Right.
something that I observe. Now, on the other hand, I think that the Trump administration approach seems to me fundamentally misguided in a couple of ways. First, I don't see the U.S. having all that much leverage in all of this. I don't think that the U.S. is the primary actor. And if the U.S. is going to withdraw its leverage from Ukraine, as we've been discussing, less aid, less military support, and if the U.S. is putting tariffs on European partners and, in a way, diminishing the transatlantic relationship, it's taking the leverage out of its own hands that it would need to come to a resolution of the war in Ukraine. That's one point. Another point is the process is incredibly chaotic. And
Mhm.
that may have worked in certain other situations, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Israel, Gaza. I don't want to sort of dismiss it across the board, but I don't think it's working here because there's so many pieces to the puzzle. And so there's very little consultation with Europe, which is a major actor. There's a certain tendency to dictate terms to the Ukrainians, who are in the middle of the fight and have a lot of agency themselves. And I don't see a very accurate sense, as we've been discussing a moment ago, of what the Russian motivations are. I think because they want to get across the finish line, the Trump team is lowballing Russian motivations and saying
Mhm.
it's just about territory in the Donbass or eastern Ukraine, when I think it's about much more.
Right.
And so they end up not getting where they need to go. So some of the instincts I think are correct. I think the process to me makes very little sense.
And we talked about the messiness of this, and the fact that Witkoff, whatever his diplomatic skills and negotiating skills are, literally just is coming off the heels of Gaza, Israel. and now is jumping into another extremely complicated negotiation. You know, I mentioned earlier we're both historians. We look towards history to learn things, try to get some generalizations if we can. Obviously, it's not going to tell you the exact path to take. But historically, how do you view this? Do you view any other historical time periods or negotiations that we can sort of draw anything from?
Yeah, none of them is going to be very encouraging in a way, although it's all just food for thought. So, 1905, Russo-Japanese War ends with a treaty that's finalized in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So,
Mhm.
sometimes when I see them meeting in Miami, I'm kind of reminded of that there's a negotiation on the east coast of the U.S. about things far across the Atlantic Ocean. I think Potsdam is very important. Yalta and Potsdam are very important as comparative points, but those are at the end of a war
Mhm.
in which the U.S. and the Soviet Union were deeply involved, and they were allies actually in the Second World War. So
Right.
we can dislike some of the outcomes, the kind of dividing up of Europe, but it follows very naturally and organically from the way that the Second World War was fought. I think you could turn to the 1990s and Richard Holbrooke in Yugoslavia, but there the structural situation is almost the opposite of what we have now. There you have military preeminence on the part of the U.S., an ability to kind of really dictate realities on the ground, a total disparity of military strength between Serbia and the United States. And Richard Holbrooke was able on that basis to kind of go in and end the conflict, maybe incompletely, but pretty much to end it. That's just not at all where the U.S. is in Ukraine. So I don't know which of these precedents you could draw on to come to a conclusion that the U.S. has what it takes or what it needs to get to the end line here. In some ways, they're also different from the current situation and approach that it looks like the U.S. is, going to really struggle to get the results it wants.
Yeah, and I'll get you out of here on this one last question. So, if you put your policy planning hat back on, and we're at the State Department today, what would you be trying to push as far as policy for the U.S. or negotiating tactics to the team that's dealing with the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the Russians?
I think the first thing is to determine what the core U.S. interests are here. And that's not the clearest of stories over the last 10, 15 years when it comes to Ukraine. I would identify them, this is different from the Trump administration I know, as the containment of Russian military power in Ukraine and in the region. And if it sounds like a George Kennan like approach to the problem, that's very conscious. And so, more so than a neat diplomatic arrangement that "quote unquote" ends the conflict, I would really think about containment. I think actually we've succeeded over the last 3.5, 4 years in containing Russian military power in many ways. And it's important to tell the story of transatlantic partnership in Ukraine as in part a success story. And so we need to keep it up. We need to think of Ukraine's integration into Europe as, I think, an American interest that will contribute over the long term to the stability of the region. So you need to contain Russian military power on the one hand, you need to integrate Ukraine into European structures on the other, and that's something on which we can work with the Europeans. And of course, this is again not the spirit of the Trump administration, really prioritizing transatlantic cooperation, deliberation, consultation, and work. I don't think I'll sort of drive this point home again. I don't think that the U.S. has the leverage to do much on its own in Ukraine, and so I think it has to share its approach, and it has partners and allies who I do think have a reasonable approach to the conflict, and so it all feels doable to me. The containment of Russian military power, the integration of Ukraine into Europe, and the strengthening of a transatlantic foundation. But how does one say this would be an aspirational
Yeah.
policy under present conditions? Because clearly the Trump administration has different priorities. If I could try to characterize what those are, because it's important, or I think it's very important to try to understand those priorities. I think their priority is a cessation of hostilities as quickly as possible,
Yeah.
a Europeanization of the conflict, so that the containment of Russian military power is a European responsibility, 75% European, 25% US, and a limit to the war or an end to the war so that the US can focus on the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific. So the strategic orientation of the White House is objectively quite different from my own.
Yeah. No, and I think that shines through in what they're, how they're going about this, sort of jumping from one conflict to the other, just trying to get things ended, leaving a lot of the details to be figured out later, but sort of taking things as a win and then moving on to the next thing. And I think that speaks to some of the muddiness that we've seen over the past couple of weeks and the back and forth on trying to get something done. And the one extreme on the paper to begin with, then moving to the other extreme, then maybe moving back to the middle after they talked to Putin today, just trying, throwing spaghetti at the wall, so to speak. So, but obviously we'll be watching this. This could all be OBE in 4 or 5 hours. I doubt it, but we will, I'm sure, be in touch with you again in the coming weeks to see what's going on here and how this all plays out. But Michael, thanks again for joining us. I really appreciate it, and be sure to check out his book Collisions. I can attest, it's a great book. I read it last summer, and it's a great explainer on Ukraine and the U.S. role there, and how Russia sees it. So be sure to check that out. So thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Kelly. Such a pleasure to join for this conversation.